are that when I consume water, I end up eating exactly equivalent amount of energy as I do when I consume the low-calorie sweetener drink. So that suggests that sweetness is neither having a positive nor a negative effect on energy intake in this test meal. And the reason I've given you these figures is because overall in the studies we looked at, and there are many studies here, overall there's 1,319 participants in the studies that we reviewed. And there were studies in children and adults. The results were pretty much the same, that when a low-calorie sweetener drink was consumed in place of sugar, less energy was consumed overall. And here, just to show you some of the details, I know you can't see this very well, but overall it actually turns out there was about 50% compensation overall, slightly higher in children, but not significantly so. So that's the sum total of those results. Here are the results for water. This is comparing low-calorie sweeteners with water. Absolutely no difference. The effect size here is minus 2 calories. Absolutely no difference. And you can also see there were some studies on low-calorie sweeteners versus unsweetened food and nothing at all. Again, there were no significant differences in those studies between low-calorie sweeteners and the control situation. So it does look like a low-calorie sweetener drink or food does not increase energy intake compared with an unsweetened control, nor does it decrease it in those studies. And then lastly, we have these sustained intervention studies, and Craig gave a very nice summary of some of the details of these studies. And here overall, here is a meta-analysis of those studies, adults and children. So this is the effect on body weight of these in these studies at the longest follow-up period at the time we did this review. And you can see actually in every single study, weight was lower when low-calorie sweetener products, usually drinks, substituted sugar-containing drinks. Not always statistically significant, and in fact, in few studies was this a significant effect, but overall, there's a clear overall effect, which is highly statistically significant. So lower body weight across these studies. And here is a surprising result. This certainly surprised me. In terms of body weight, we had 3 studies at the time which compared low-calorie sweeteners with water. And in those studies, the overall effect is an advantage for low-calorie sweeteners over water. So lower body weight on low-calorie sweeteners versus water. And the energy intakes where they were measured in these studies supported that, those overall results. So an energy deficit in groups consuming low-calorie sweeteners versus sugar, and in one study, low-calorie sweeteners versus water. So that all looks quite good, I think, for low-calorie sweeteners. And I'll come back in a minute to some conclusions. But I want to just deal with one more issue. So we've talked about low-calorie sweeteners and this hypothesis about low-calorie sweeteners confusing appetite control. I've suggested I really don't buy that argument, both because of results and both because of the logic. But even if there is an effect there, it's outweighed by the energy dilution effect, and that's why we see the advantages in the intervention trials. There is this other issue about being exposed to sweetness increases our desire for sweetness. We're more motivated to consume more sweetness, and that could be a bad thing. And that's articulated in these various quotes here. I'm not going to read these out, but these vary from rather subtle arguments to really blatant arguments that sweetness is really a very bad thing in the diet. But there is an alternative view here, which is that when I'm exposed to a sweet drink, for example, perhaps that reduces my desire for a sweet taste. And that would be consistent with this idea of sensory-specific satiety, which really articulates and demonstrates the experience that we all have. When we're eating a food, then our desire for that food declines fairly rapidly during the meal. But our desire, our motivation to eat other food that we haven't recently eaten is maintained relatively high. In other words, we're losing interest in the specific food. And there is evidence we might lose interest for the specific taste. So if it's a savory food that I'm eating, then it's other savory foods that I've lost interest in, but I can still eat a sweet dessert. So something we know in the UK and the US as having a dessert stomach, which was readily demonstrated last night at our meal. In fact, after the very large first portion, some of us were still able to eat a sweet dessert. So what is it? Does sweetness increase, exposure to sweetness increase or decrease our desire for sweet taste? Well, we've done a series of experiments in Bristol on this subject, and I'm just going to describe one of those. So in this particular study, participants on one occasion consume 300 mils of water. And then after consuming the water, they're invited to evaluate the taste and their desire to consume various foods, which include, in this study, consuming apple juice, apple fruit, fresh fruit, or apple pie. So these are all sweet foods, and we're interested in the effect of consuming water on our desire for consuming those foods. And we're interested in comparing that with the effect of consuming a sweet drink, in this case a blackcurrant squash drink, so a sweet, fruity drink. And the question is, does water or the blackcurrant squash reduce our desire for these other sweet foods, which reduces the most? And actually what we have here is the century-specific satiety hypothesis supported that consuming a sweet drink reduces our desire for apple juice, fresh apple as well, and apple pie more than water does. And that turns out to be consistent with an observation from one of the long-term intervention studies where it was observed that participants consuming low-calorie sweeteners, the diet beverage group in this study, actually consumed fewer desserts, fewer sweet foods than the water group in this study. Actually, it also reduced, which is not said here, it also the diet beverage group consumed less fruits and vegetables as well, which would be consistent with our findings. So a bit of a mixed thing there. So low-calorie sweeteners are reducing our appetite, our desire for sweet foods, but including fruits. So here are my overall conclusions. So reducing the energy density of the diet with low-calorie sweeteners, albeit a small amount, and the scope for doing that depends on how much sugar is consumed in the first place in the diet. But we would expect that to lead to overall reduction in energy intake and body weight, and randomized controlled trials demonstrates that is indeed the case. In terms of these other hypotheses about low-calorie sweeteners confusing our brain or increasing our desire for sweetness, making us habituated or even addicted to sweet taste, I would argue there's really very little evidence for that in either case. If anything, the evidence is in the opposite direction in both cases. Well, certainly in the final case. And as I say, I'll just say it once more, even if there is a germ of truth in either of these problem areas, that problem is outweighed by the energy dilution effect overall. So the argument would be to choose a low-calorie sweetener drink, for example, over a sugar-sweetened containing drink. So thank you.
Parabéns para os nossos palestrantes e abro para perguntas. Acho que ficou bem explicado, né, a questão desses edulcorantes adicionados a bebidas, no sentido de não interferirem, né, no aumento das calorias ingeridas. Acho que isso é bastante interessante para nós. Perguntas?
Can I go ahead and ask a question? Okay, thank you. Dr. Johnson and Dr. Rogers, thank you for the great presentation. I have a question about, observational studies. I think you have alluded, maybe Dr. Rogers, in terms of which one is leading to obesity. So I'm talking about reverse causality. Is it like people that are consuming low-calorie sweeteners? Are they consuming it because they're trying to manage some kind of end disease point, or they're trying to manage type 2 diabetes, or trying to lose weight, etc. But in what we see sometimes in the association is that reverse, which is like low-calorie sweetener cause obesity or type 2 diabetes. So in these observational studies, is it possible somehow to control those kind of reverse causalities? Maybe that's one of the reasons why we have this confusion, even though the double-blind placebo-controlled studies usually shows that low-calorie sweetener benefit. In fact, you may lose some weight.
I don't think it is possible to control for reverse causality in association studies, even in prospective cohort studies. So to give another example about this, I suggested actually that missing breakfast ought to, or does, apparently reduce our daily energy intake. However, there's very, very strong evidence that missing breakfast is positively associated with obesity. In other words, if you miss breakfast, you're more likely to be overweight. But as David Allison and colleagues have shown very elegantly, that's almost certainly reverse causality. So if I'm overweight, I get up in the morning and I think today is going to be a good day. I'm going to start by missing my first meal of the day. But of course I fail in the long run and I end up overeating. That's why we see that relationship. And potentially why we see that relationship with low-calorie sweeteners and obesity. I'm using these substances, as the cartoon showed, I'm using these substances to try and offset the fact that I'm overeating elsewhere in my diet. And so we have to do intervention studies.
Perguntas? Todos estão.
A question for both of you. I think you've both shown very nicely that the effects of low-calorie sweeteners do, in fact, reduce the number of calories we consume on a day-to-day basis. However, I think the impacts on weight management, Craig, seem to be minimal. So in terms of moving forward, how do you see, I think the obesity epidemic has really come to the fore over the last 30, 40 years. So how do we get back to utopia from, time before? Is it even possible? Low-calorie sweeteners may play a role in that, but where do we go from here?
Do we get back to utopia? Man, I hate to be the bummer, but probably not. I think that the way that we view food and our accessibility to food and so many things in the environment, I don't really see a time where we say obesity is not an issue. I think it is here for us to figure out how to best deal with some of the consequences of it, but it would take huge societal shifts for us to really, I really do think we're looking at a time where we need some revolutionary thought with what we're doing. And I was just having a discussion with someone where we talked about, how do we change the technology of food, right? Low-calorie sweeteners provide a great kind of paradigm to how to do that. How do we still get a sweet taste with no calories? Well, why aren't we doing that in other ways with food as well? And I think there's opportunity for that, but we've probably pushed behaviorally about as far as we can go with this. And we need something else, right? But I would still say, like, the things that help us to maintain is incredibly beneficial. Even if we're not going to defeat the obesity epidemic that sits in front of us, like, these small things that we can do are still incredibly important for things like quality of life and longevity of life.
Yes, I would just add to that. I think it's not surprising that the effects of substituting low-calorie sweeteners for sugar are relatively small effects on body weight. That's because there's only so much sugar in the diet of most people to substitute, and only part of it can be substituted. There's also some compensation, appetite compensation effect as demonstrated. So yes, the effects of low-calorie sweeteners on their own will be limited, but they are one weapon, I guess, in the war. And I think it's very unfortunate that, in a sense, misinformation about their usefulness is actually reducing their impact on public health because consumers are avoiding them because of, as you've described and as we've described, unfounded fears about their effects.
Ninguém mais?
Olá, eu sei que esse não foi o tema do painel, mas eu queria perguntar para vocês dois se vocês acham que os tipos de adoçantes fazem diferença, quais seriam mais saudáveis, enfim, entre estévia, aspartame, sucralose, isso já foi falado antes, me desculpem, e xilitol, esse último que estão falando que é um dos mais saudáveis.
So I only partially heard the question, but I think the question was, do different types of low-calorie sweeteners have different effects? I suspect not. We haven't yet done that analysis on all the studies that we looked at. I keep meaning to get around to it, but I haven't done it. But my suspicion is there won't be a difference between sweeteners. A potential advantage of stevia is that it may be more acceptable to consumers, but at the moment it's only used for partial reduction of sugar in beverages, or in most cases. So that limits its effectiveness somewhat. So short answer is no. I think the effects of low-calorie sweeteners depend on the fact that they remove some sugar from the diet, and they all have the same effect there.
Yeah, I know of no head-to-head studies that have compared what would take place with that. I'd actually be really surprised if that study exists at all. But yeah, like, which one is going to be most impactful? For me, it's the one that people will be most adherent to, right? What is it that someone is most likely to use? And that one probably wins the day. I think what's complicated with that is the way that taste develops and taste preferences develops, and probably that's different depending on locality, depending on all sorts of different things. And so, the way that we get taste preference isn't simply like the quality of the sweetness or something like that. It's really what we grew up with. And so for me, aspartame will always win because I grew up with aspartame. But I'd say it's the one that I'm most likely to use. I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Mais alguma pergunta, pessoal? Se não tiver, então, nós agradecemos muito nossos palestrantes, agradecemos a presença e as palestras proferidas. Muito obrigada.